Warren Idoko had been called many things during his 14 years as a compliance auditor, and tedious was, by a wide margin, the kindest of them. He didn't particularly mind. He had made a kind of peace years earlier with the fact that his job existed precisely because most people found the work he did too boring to do carefully, and he had come to understand that being underestimated in his line of work was less an obstacle than a professional advantage. Nobody watched their words carefully around a man they'd already decided wasn't worth watching. He arrived at Havern Colony, a mid-sized Sevrathi settlement contracted under a joint resource-sharing agreement with Earth's Expeditionary Trade Division, with a modest travel case, a battered data slate that had survived 3 prior postings, and a mandate so narrow it had taken the colony's administrative staff exactly 1 meeting to dismiss him as irrelevant. A routine 6-month review of emergency reserve allocation records, required under the terms of the joint agreement, largely as a formality nobody expected to produce anything of consequence. "You understand," Director Ilieth Corvin told him during their first meeting, with the polished, faintly weary patience of an administrator managing a minor diplomatic obligation, that this colony has operated under Sevrathi Compact oversight for 11 years without a single significant compliance finding. "Your review is, I am confident, a matter of formality." "I'm sure it will be," Warren agreed pleasantly. "I'll still need to review the full allocation ledgers, going back 3 years, along with the supporting distribution records for each quarter." Corvin's expression shifted, briefly, into something that might have been irritation, quickly smoothed back into professional courtesy. "That is a considerable volume of documentation for a formality, Auditor Idoko." "It usually is," Warren said. "I find formalities go smoother when you check them properly the first time." He spent his first 3 weeks at Havern Colony doing exactly what every prior posting had trained him to do: reading. Not skimming, not sampling, not running the kind of statistical spot checks that most compliance reviews relied on to make an impossibly large volume of records manageable in a limited time frame. Reading, line by line, quarter by quarter. The full 3 years of emergency reserve allocation records the colony's resource management division had on file. It was, by any reasonable measure, extraordinarily boring work, and Warren was aware, within the colony's administrative offices, that his reputation had solidified rapidly into something between mild amusement and genuine irritation. He asked Clerk Bassett for the raw distribution manifests yesterday. Warren overheard one administrative aide remark to another, in the break room outside his assigned office, apparently unaware or unconcerned that he could hear them. "Not the quarterly summaries, the raw manifests. Do you know how many pages that is?" "He asked me the same thing," the other aide replied. "I told him the summaries were audited and verified. He said he'd like to see the raw data anyway. Said something about summaries being accurate representations of what someone chose to summarize, not necessarily accurate representations of everything that happened. That's absurd. The summaries are compiled directly from the source data." "That's what I told him." He said that was reassuring, and then asked for the raw manifests anyway. Warren, seated at his desk down the corridor, allowed himself a small, private smile and continued reading. The discrepancy, when he finally found it, was small enough that he nearly missed it himself, buried in the 4th quarter of the 2nd year's distribution manifests, a routine transfer of emergency medical reserves to what the record identified as Auxiliary Storage Facility 7, a designation that appeared, on closer inspection, in exactly one other place across 3 full years of records. A nearly identical transfer, 18 months later, also routed to Auxiliary Storage Facility 7, also for emergency medical reserves, also in a quantity that, on its own, looked entirely unremarkable. It was the kind of thing, Warren understood immediately, that any reasonable statistical sampling review would have missed entirely. 2 transactions, 18 months apart, in a record system containing literally thousands of similar entries, each one individually unremarkable, together forming a pattern only visible to someone who had actually read every single page, rather than trusting a summary or a sample to represent the whole. He pulled up the colony's official facility registry, cross-referencing Auxiliary Storage Facility 7 against the colony's documented infrastructure. It didn't exist. Not officially, at least. No listed location, no assigned staff, no maintenance records, no physical coordinates anywhere in the colony's registered facility database. A storage facility that had, according to the distribution manifests, received 2 significant shipments of emergency medical reserves over the past 3 years, and that appeared nowhere else in any record Warren could locate. He sat with that discovery for a long moment, feeling the particular quiet satisfaction that 14 years of tedious, unglamorous work had taught him to recognize. Not excitement, exactly, but the settled certainty of a question that had finally found its answer, even if that answer raised considerably more questions than it resolved. Then he began, patiently, methodically, to ask them. Auxiliary Storage Facility 7, Warren said, during his next scheduled meeting with the colony's Resource Management Division, addressing his question to Clerk Ressa Tarvin, a nervous, junior Sevrathi Records clerk who had been assigned to handle most of his documentation requests. I don't see it in the colony's facility registry. Could you help me locate the relevant infrastructure records? Something flickered across Tarvin's face, brief, but unmistakable, the particular flash of alarm Warren had learned, across 14 years, to recognize as the look of someone who knew considerably more than they were prepared to say. I would need to research that designation, Tarvin said, her voice carefully controlled. It may be an older facility name that has since been superseded in our current registry system. That's certainly possible, Warren said pleasantly. Could you look into it and let me know what you find? No particular rush. I'm here for another few weeks yet. Tarvin agreed, with visible relief at the reprieve, and Warren returned to his office and continued reading. It took Tarvin 9 days to respond, which was, in Warren's experience, precisely the length of time it took someone to work up the courage to either lie convincingly or tell the truth reluctantly. And when she finally appeared at his office door, late in the evening after most of the administrative staff had gone home, he understood immediately, from her expression, which one it would be. I could not locate any registry record for Auxiliary Storage Facility 7, she said, closing the door quietly behind her, because it does not exist, not as a physical facility. It is a designation, I believe, though I cannot prove this with documentation I am authorized to access, used to route reserve shipments to a private holding arrangement outside the colony's official infrastructure. Warren set down the data slate he'd been working from, giving her his full, patient attention. Whose private holding arrangement? He asked gently. Tarvin hesitated, her hands twisting nervously in front of her. I do not have proof. I have suspicion, based on which authorization codes appear on the relevant transfer orders. If I am wrong, I will have made a very serious accusation against a very senior official for nothing. I understand the risk, Warren said. I'm not going to pretend I can eliminate it entirely, but I can tell you that 14 years of doing this work has taught me that people rarely come to my office after hours, looking as frightened as you look right now, over something that turns out to be nothing. I'd like to hear what you suspect, and I'll do everything within my authority to make sure it's investigated carefully and that you're protected in the process. Tarvin was quiet for a long moment, weighing something Warren couldn't fully see. Then, finally, she spoke. Overseer Klim Bratha, she said quietly, the authorization codes on both transfers trace back to his office. He oversees resource allocation across the colony's entire emergency reserve system. If he has been diverting medical reserves to a private facility that does not officially exist, he would be one of very few officials with both the access and the authority to do so undetected. Warren's next several weeks were, by any external measure, remarkably unremarkable, more reading, more careful cross-referencing, more patient, methodical requests for documentation that administrative staff across the colony had grown visibly weary of fielding. He requested infrastructure maintenance logs for every facility within the colony's registered network, cross-referencing them against energy consumption records, personnel assignment logs, and supply requisition orders spanning the full 3-year review period. He found, buried across 11 separate document sets that no single review would ever have thought to cross-reference against each other, a pattern considerably larger than the 2 transfers he'd initially discovered. A slow, patient diversion of emergency medical reserves, agricultural surplus, and critical spare parts, rooted in small, individually unremarkable quantities to a rotating series of non-existent facility designations. Spanning the entire 3 years of records under his review, and he suspected strongly, though couldn't yet prove, considerably longer than that. Director Ilieth Corvain, when Warren finally requested a formal meeting to present his preliminary findings, listened to the initial summary with visibly thinning patience. "You are telling me," Corvain said, "that after 11 years of clean compliance review under this colony's administration, a routine formality audit has somehow uncovered evidence of systematic resource diversion, based entirely on the observation that 2 shipping manifests, 18 months apart, reference a facility not listed in our registry." "That's where the review started, yes," Warren said. "It's grown considerably since then. I've identified what I believe are 11 separate diversion instances across 3 years, all routed through similarly non-existent facility designations, all authorized through channels tracing back to a single office. And you believe this constitutes proof of deliberate fraud, rather than, for instance, a records management inefficiency that has persisted, unremarked, for several years." "I believe it warrants a formal investigation," Warren said, with the same patient, unhurried persistence that had carried him through 14 years of exactly this kind of conversation. "I'm not asking you to accept my conclusion as final. I'm asking for access to the physical inventory records for the colony's actual emergency reserve stockpiles, so the diverted quantities can be verified against what should currently be on hand. If I'm wrong, that verification will show it clearly, and I'll close this matter with an apology for the inconvenience. If I'm right, I think you'll want to know before this colony faces an actual emergency and discovers its reserves are considerably thinner than the official records suggest." Corvain studied him for a long moment, something in her expression shifting slightly, not quite belief, but the reluctant consideration of someone who had, despite every instinct to dismiss the matter, begun to recognize that dismissing it carried its own risk. "I will authorize the physical inventory verification," she said finally. "I want to be clear, Auditor Idoko, that I remain skeptical of the scale you are proposing, but I am not prepared to ignore a properly documented request, however tedious I find the process that produced it." Undersecretary Payne Asher, Earth's diplomatic liaison to Havron Colony, found Warren in his office 2 days later, his expression carrying the particular strained diplomacy of someone caught between competing obligations. "Warren," Asher said, closing the door behind him, "I need to have a candid conversation with you." "Of course," Warren said. "Director Corvain has raised concerns, through appropriate channels, about the scope of your review exceeding its original mandate. Your formal instructions were a routine reserve allocation compliance check. You've expanded that into what is functionally a fraud investigation targeting a senior Sevrathi official, based on evidence that, from what I've reviewed, remains largely circumstantial." "I understand the concern," Warren said. "I'd point out that the fraud investigation grew directly out of the routine compliance check, following exactly the evidence the records themselves produced. I didn't set out to investigate Overseer Bratha. I set out to review 3 years of allocation manifests, and the manifests led where they led." "I'm not questioning your integrity," Asher said, with visible discomfort. "I'm telling you that this colony's diplomatic relationship with the Sevrathi Compact is delicate, and a formal accusation against a senior official, if it turns out to be wrong, or even if it turns out to be right, but handled clumsily, could damage 11 years of carefully maintained cooperation. I'd like you to consider closing your review with the standard formal findings and letting Compact Internal Affairs handle any further investigation through their own channels, quietly, without a formal human-authored accusation attached to it. Warren considered this for a long moment, weighing the genuine diplomatic concern against 14 years of watching exactly this kind of pressure, applied politely and reasonably, convince careful investigators to stop asking questions one step before they found what mattered. I understand the diplomatic risk, he said finally. I want you to understand mine if I'm right and I stop asking questions now. This colony's emergency medical reserves have, by my preliminary estimate, been diverted at a rate that would leave them dangerously short in any significant crisis. If I close this review quietly and something happens, a disease outbreak, a natural disaster, anything that actually requires those reserves, people are going to die because the record said supplies existed that in reality did not. I'm not willing to trade that risk for diplomatic convenience, Undersecretary. I'll finish the physical inventory verification Director Corvain has already authorized. If it shows I'm wrong, I'll close this matter exactly the way you're suggesting, with a full apology. If it shows I'm right, I think the diplomatic relationship survives a properly documented, carefully handled finding considerably better than it survives a preventable crisis nobody saw coming because the person who noticed the warning signs was asked, politely, to stop looking. Asher was quiet for a long moment. I can't officially endorse that position, he said finally, but I'm not going to formally order you to stand down either. Finish your inventory check, Warren, quickly, if you can manage it. And be right, because if you're not, this is going to cost both of us considerably more than an apology. The physical inventory verification, conducted over the following 6 days by a joint team of colony logistics staff and Warren's own careful oversight, confirmed what 14 years of Warren Idoko's tedious, unglamorous persistence had suspected since a single unremarkable facility designation had first caught his attention in a 3-year-old shipping manifest. The colony's actual emergency medical reserves stood at roughly 61% of what the official records indicated should be on hand. Agricultural surplus reserves, similarly verified, showed a comparable shortfall. Critical spare parts inventory, cross-checked against maintenance logs for the colony's life support infrastructure, revealed gaps that, in the event of any significant equipment failure, would have left the colony without adequate replacement components for systems several thousand residents depended on to breathe. Overseer Clem Bratha was placed under formal Sevrathi Compact investigation 4 days after the verification's results were reported, once internal audit teams, working from the extensive documentation trail Warren had painstakingly assembled, traced the diverted resources to a private holding operation Bratha had, over several years, quietly built to supply a lucrative black market resale network, operating well beyond the colony's official oversight. Nearly 3 years, Bratha reportedly told investigators during his formal questioning. According to the summary Warren was eventually permitted to review, and not one Sevrathi auditor ever noticed the pattern. I did not believe a human paperwork inspector sent for a routine formality would be the one to find it. Director Corvain, reviewing the full investigation findings alongside Warren in her office some weeks later, was considerably quieter than she had been during their earlier, more skeptical exchanges. 11 years of clean compliance review, she said, and I now understand that those reviews were, without exception, sampling-based statistical checks rather than comprehensive line-by-line review. Bratha's diversion pattern was specifically designed to remain invisible to exactly that kind of sampling, small enough, individually, to never trigger a statistical anomaly flag, spread across enough transactions and enough time that no reasonable sample size would ever happen to catch more than one instance in isolation. That's usually how these things work, Warren said. Fraud that survives statistical sampling almost always survives because someone understood exactly how the sampling worked and built the diversion pattern specifically to stay beneath its threshold. The only real defense against that kind of fraud is exactly the kind of review nobody wants to fund or authorize, because it's slow and expensive and boring, and 99 times out of 100, it finds nothing at all worth the tedium. "And the 100th time?" Corvin asked. "The 100th time," Warren said, "it finds something that would have cost this colony its emergency medical reserves in the middle of an actual crisis. I think that 100th time is worth the other 99. Honestly, though I understand why that's a hard case to make to anyone signing off on the budget for it." Undersecretary Payne Asher found Warren in the colony's small departure lounge, 3 days before his scheduled transport home, reviewing what appeared to be an entirely unrelated set of documents with the same patient, unhurried focus he brought to everything. "I owe you an apology," Asher said, settling into the seat across from him. "I asked you to stop looking 3 weeks ago because I was worried about diplomatic convenience. If you'd listened to me, this colony would currently believe it had emergency reserves that don't exist, and Overseer Bratha would still be quietly running a black market operation with the colony's medical supplies." "You had a legitimate concern," Warren said, not looking up from his reading. "Diplomatic relationships matter. I understood why you raised it, even though I disagreed about how to weigh it against the risk. Director Corvin has formally requested," Asher continued, "that the Sevrathi Compact adopt comprehensive line-by-line review as standard practice for all future compliance audits across this colony, rather than statistical sampling. She's citing your review specifically as the model." "That's generous of her," Warren said. "It's not generous," Asher said. "It's an admission that 11 years of statistical sampling missed a fraud that a routine formality audit, conducted the tedious way, caught within 4 months. I don't think generosity has much to do with it. I think it's simply an acknowledgement of what actually works, however unglamorous it looks from the outside." Warren finally looked up from his reading, considering the observation with the same patient seriousness he brought to most things. "I've been called tedious more times than I can count across 14 years of this work," he said. "Undisciplined imagination, someone told me once, choosing to focus on details nobody else thought mattered instead of seeing the bigger picture. I used to let that bother me a little. I don't anymore. The bigger picture usually takes care of itself, if you're patient enough to actually look at every piece of it, instead of trusting that a summary of the pieces tells you the same thing the pieces themselves would." "What made you keep asking 3 weeks ago?" Asher asked, "when I gave you a perfectly reasonable diplomatic reason to stop?" Warren considered the question for a long moment. 14 years of watching what happens when people stop asking one question too early, he said finally. "Most of the time, stopping costs nothing because there was nothing there to find. But you never know which time is the exception until you've already asked the next question. So I've just made a habit, over the years, of asking it anyway. It's not a particularly exciting skill, Undersecretary, but it's turned out to matter more times than I'd have expected when I first started doing this work." Asher was quiet for a moment, watching the departure lounge's other travelers move through their own unremarkable business. "For what it's worth," he said finally, "I think this colony is considerably safer for having had someone tedious enough to keep asking." Warren allowed himself a small, quiet smile and returned to his reading, because there was, as there very often was, one more question worth asking before he was finished.